Welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. It's December, that means the late season, so there's still time to fill that freezer and not eat tag soup. All right, what's going on? Thank you for listening as always. So yeah, like I said, it is the month of December. We are actually a full week into it already. And let's see, there's been a lot going on, but also not a lot going on since the South Dakota trip back in November, just before Thanksgiving. I've been on a few hunts. It's kind of been a hit or miss where I've either haven't seen much of anything or had some opportunities, which we'll get into with a little bit later on to the episode here. But before we jump into anything, as always, if you like this episode, make sure you hit that like, subscribe to the channel, share the show with your friends, and be sure to head on over to mihuntingpodcast.com. Check out all the content available. I've added an additional feature or additional page on the site where it's going to be essentially a blog where I have recipes available and articles. So make sure you check out those as they get added. Head on over to the store where I've added the Grocery Deer clothing line. This is a design I came up with a little while ago. Basically, it's kind of a tribute to Dennis from South Dakota. Any of the, a smaller deer or a doe, that's what he dubbed them as, a grocery deer. I like the phrase there. So added a grocery deer items into the store. We've got a t-shirt, hoodie, as well as stickers available. And if you're wanting more content or would like to support the show directly, click that join us button, become a member. Your membership, again, supports this show directly, as well as grants you special access to exclusive member-only content, giveaways, and discounts. So let's go ahead and get into the topics at hand. So I guess what we're going to do is to start out with a bit of a recap on what's been going on since the last episode, really. And then I want to get into some of the things that I'm going to be focusing on for the late season, some of my tactics that I'm going to be focusing on. So let's get into it. So basically from that South Dakota trip, got kind of home, got settled back in again, enjoyed Thanksgiving with the family. And then we did our annual deer drive for Black Friday. We ended up not having as many people as we initially intended. We kind of had a fairly decent party lined up, but then things, happened as they may. We ended up with a much smaller group of individuals. We actually ended up with only just 4 of us when we were going to have probably about double that to start the day out. So we did the drive, a few does that we saw, and then one small buck. That was about it. So then from there, we kind of packed it up, and then my buddy that came out for the drive, Lee, we were just kind of sitting around chit-chatting and decided to go do some scouting at a nearby parcel. Walked that area. Basically, it had some pretty good terrain. We had kind of like an open, fallow field mixed with hardwoods, and had a pond on it as well. Well, according to the map, it was a lake, but I don't know if you could really call this a lake or not. And then it had some terrain, or I guess some elevation differences. Had a small saddle in it. Scouted out, and we actually somewhat were surprised of the concentration of the sign. It was isolated to one area. Some of the terrain features that we figured would be, more, that would have more sign, I guess I would say. They didn't produce much fruit. However, speaking of fruit, my buddy Lee did find on one corner of the pond up on a hill, there was a lone apple tree that still had apples on it. And down at the base of that, next to the pond, there was a substantial amount of sign that led up to another area on the other side of the pond that did have some sign. We basically found some rubs, what looked like could be some old beds up there as well. So basically everything was kind of isolated to one side of the pond, or one end of it, I guess I would say, which ended up, being one of those things that once we found, that apple tree, everything kind of made sense as to how the deer were utilizing the terrain, basically on one end of that pond, because that's where a lot of the best features were. That's the edge of the fallow field. You had the apple tree, and then you had quick access from a private parcel that led across down into some other timber. And then for the rest of the rifle season after that, I mean, it was pretty much uneventful. I ended up taking my wife out hunting. It'd been, oh my gosh, so many years since she's come out for a hunt with me. We had a good time. Unfortunately, we didn't see anything. We were basically just sitting in the blind, overlooking the food plot. It's kind of been that's the case, at least down the farm. A lot of the movement has been pretty slow. I think that basically a lot of it has to do with, especially during rifle season, those deer have been pressured so much that even the does don't really, or weren't really wanting to come out. The other issue is that, basically, again, the way the farm's broken up is that there's a big field on top near the house. There's a small creek bottom that cuts kind of through the middle of the property, and then we have a food plot down at the one or the far end of the property. So I've been a few times I went out hunting and I didn't see much movement or whatnot, but Mike, who owns the property, he would see several deer coming out. They're still coming out to some of the old cut cornfield. It's about 10 acres. There's still a few deer going out there, but again, a lot of the movement is at night. But it looks like some of that's starting to change as things are kind of settling down now that the regular firearm season is over. And we actually have, well, at the time of recording this, I'm going to go out one last time for the last day of muzzleloader season. And then from there, we are at the, then we have the late antlerless, and then the remainder of the late bow season. So for muzzleloader, it came down to, again, it's kind of the same at the farm. Did end up seeing a 5-point one evening. I think it was just a 1.5-year-old buck, so it was kind of one of those things that I could have filled my tag on that buck as he was legal for me, but my goal is, at least for that area, is to shoot a little bit older bucks. Ideally for me, 3-year-old or better. That's kind of where I kind of want to be. At least let some of those bucks get to bigger or older age classes and get some bigger antlers as well. Some of the bigger bucks are still showing up on trail camera. I've actually had a couple new bucks show up as well. One really interesting, I believe is a 6-point, or he may even be it as a slick 4-point, but very tall rack, very tall tines. But he just doesn't have much else going on, but very, very tall, very interesting looking buck. And then it looks like we've got some similar genetics. There's another younger buck, very big body deer, but his antlers, again, aren't quite as big. So I suspect he is a younger deer. He's just, I guess, well fed, I guess I should say. And he looks like he has the same genetics of that bigger one, because they're very, very similar, but you can definitely tell that one is just a younger deer. So it's interesting to see a different set of genetics in the area than I've really witnessed in the past. So, and then out on public ground, I doing a lot of that again now, especially that the regular firearm season has included. A lot of the other hunters have packed it up, gone home for the season. Went out to the bluffs again, and it's been tough up there. It looks like that area just got so much pressure. There's still a lot of sign of other hunters that have been up in there, and you can definitely tell the deer have felt the pressure. And then around here locally, I've gone out a few times with the muzzleloader. Again, kind of a hit or miss of, not seeing much. Or I started hunting another parcel that I've hunted before in the past. I've actually highlighted here on the show, where it's kind of more of a transition area. That there was an oak flat, and started hunting that again, just knowing that there's consistent doe movement through the area, because at this point, it's basically buck or doe. Just so I could fill the freezer and get some of these tags out of my pocket here. But it was last week, had a doe come through. Figured it was a pretty easy 50-yard shot. Ended up shooting that doe. Ultimately came down to where I tracked her for, it was 0.9 miles. Very little blood. Fortunately, there was some snow, so I was able to follow the tracks as well. Got hung up a few different times where the deer got, started mingling in where a lot of other deer have been. A lot of tracks I had to kind of decipher, kind of find my way out of that area. She ended up crossing the road. Ultimately found a bed that she had clearly, gotten pushed out of. There was very little blood in the bed itself. There was basically this kind of two small, spots of blood there. And then from there, kind of lost the track again and lost blood. At this point, and the track, it had been about 4 hours. And I suspected that with the lack of blood and the distance that the deer traveled, that it was a non-lethal hit. So, which kind of surprised me that things went the way they did in regards to, how close the deer was, as well as and basically, the fact that, it was such a poor shot. So at that point, I couldn't figure out quite exactly what had happened. Was it me? Did I pull the shot? Was the rifle or was the muzzleloader, off? Which it shouldn't have been, because, just no more than 2 weeks prior, I'd gone and sighted it in, and it was, good at 100 yards. The other thing I noticed is that when the shot went off, it didn't sound like it had the same pop that it usually did. So I wondered if maybe the powder had gotten a little wet, or if maybe the primer just didn't ignite everything like it should have. It's kind of one of those things where just something didn't feel right about what had happened. I mean, it was a 50-yard shot, and the deer was broadside, so there should have been no reason why, things shouldn't have gone better. So I ended up taking the muzzleloader out, doing some test fires again at a target, and sure enough, at 50 yards, it was shooting a good 5 inches high. So had to kind of spend a few more rounds to get the scope dialed back in again. I'm not sure why it wasn't sighted in anymore. I don't, it didn't get bumped, that at least I can recall. So I'm not sure if it's maybe just the shock of shooting it that made the scope go out of whack, or what had happened. So, but got it all sighted in again. I've also done a couple more test fires afterwards to kind of make sure that it's holding holding its sights, and it seems to be doing fine just now. So don't know what or why the difference of how it was shooting, but everything seems to be squared away now. So, and then from there, again, just the other day, or I guess it would be just yesterday, was out, same spot again, knowing that there's still plenty of deer movement in the area. Have to give it some time to cool down after me trample around everywhere, tracking the deer. As predicted, had some decent movement. Had 2 deer kind of run through my shooting lane kind of quickly. And, at that point I was kind of thinking, well, maybe, not too far away from the road, about, 230 yards away from a road. Maybe there's a road that traffic that spooked them, or, it is the secondary rut going on. So those could be potentially being pushed by bucks, because they were definitely moving, with some purpose. About 10 minutes later, sure enough, here comes another deer, kind of milling around. just caught a glimpse of it behind the trees. Deer ends up stopping behind a tree, so I'm just waiting and waiting for it to step out to properly identify it. At this point, on state ground, it was if it's a doe or any legal buck, it was pretty much gonna get shot. So waiting and waiting. Next thing I know, it takes off running back to the direction that it came from. Thinking like, all right, what just happened? This deer couldn't have smelled me because the way the wind is. And then as I look back towards the direction of where the deer was standing and up into my shooting lane, here comes a coyote chasing after the deer. So it's kind of one of those things of had a deer. Again, at this point, I kind of moved to a different spot to give me a better vantage point, a better shooting lane. Basically this deer had to make 3, maybe 4 steps for to be out in my shooting lane, which seemed to be the case. That had no indication that it wasn't going to do that, and then a coyote ruins it for me. So it's just one of those things where I think that it's just been that type of year for me in regards to I've had so many close calls, but yet it either I screw it up or the deer just doesn't cooperate or something like that coyote just running through. It always seems to be something that makes it to where I just can't get it done. So I kind of laughed about it, a little frustrated of the whole situation, kind of a mixed bag of feelings of just, because at this point I've yet to harvest a deer at all. And it just seems that like every time I try, it's just something goes wrong. But then I look back at it like this is, I guess, going to be the year where I'm just learning a lot of lessons and just stick with it and, keep trying. I think one of those things is going to, happen eventually if I just keep putting myself in those good situations. So speaking of putting myself in good situations, let's go ahead and get into how I'm going to try to accomplish that. So, there's 2 things. Well, one is kind of dying down now. It's that I'm a firm believer that it occurs and that it's a tactic that you can, or it's something that you can key onto for this late season. That is the secondary rut. Again, it's basically, any does that weren't bred during the primary rut, they will go into cycle again until they are bred. So if you had an area where you've got significant doe numbers, there's a good possibility that, some of those does may not have been bred. And then, so now you're going to have certain bucks that are aware of this and are going to, seek them out and try to breed them. Again, usually we're looking at about 4 weeks from the primary rut when this occurs. So kind of when that peak rut, occurs in your area, that's one thing that you can key on. About 4 weeks later, some of those may go into estrus again, if they haven't been bred. The other thing you're looking at is that some of the fawns, as long as they've hit somewhere around like 60 to 65 pounds, they potentially, as long as they've hit around 60 pounds or more, then they can potentially go into estrus as well for their first cycle. So if you've had some big healthy fawns, some of those doe fawns may go into estrus this year, and those bucks will certainly key on those as well. And the other nice thing is usually it's the bigger bucks or the older bucks that are aware of this and will key on it. Some of those younger bucks, those 1.5-year-olds, may not be aware of what's going on, and they might not catch on to it. Also, those bigger bucks, again, being a little bit bigger, having more mass, you're going to have the energy to be able to, do some more traveling again, and seek out those either those does or those fawns. So at this point, you may see, scrapes opening back up. You may see some fresh rubs. You may even catch a buck cruising, outside of the normal, feed the bed pattern. And so it's definitely one of those things to key on the, trail camera photos to see if any of that is occurring. You may even, at this point, you may be able to still, catch almost like a midday cruiser as well. So for me going into it, I haven't seen a lot of that activity, at least in some of the cameras I have set up as cell cameras to, on some of my scrapes. Some of the other ones I haven't checked in about a week's time. So, that some of that activity may be, showing up on some of those other cameras. I'm just not aware of it yet. But that's one thing I'm going to actually look into this morning when I go out on my last muzzleloader hunt. I'm going to be hunting back in some cover with a scrape not too far away that I know was pretty active during the primary rut. That's the same area where I had the big encounter with the big wide 8-pointer that I missed my opportunity on. And I know there's other decent bucks in the area as well, at least as long as they've survived so far. So I'm going to go back in there and kind of key in on that spot, knowing that there's does that travel through there. There's the scrape, and I've had encounters with bucks in the past there. So it's basically kind of one of those things, going back into a spot that I know that during the pre-rut was pretty good. So kind of go back into there and hope for that the movement is still there, and that if there is a buck in the area, he might hit that scrape again and be out looking for some of those does in the area that may have been, or that may be in estrus again. And then the same thing for down at the farm. I'm going to be going out with my dad here in a few days with the archery equipment again, and same thing, going to key on some one of those major travel corridors where a lot of the does come into the feeding sources. So down or up on the top field, there's a little low point where there's some kind of like the field is kind of gone fallow. It's a little marshy down in there. You've got briars and shrubs and whatnot growing in there, and forbs. So they kind of use that low point of the field to enter the field. Just on the inside of the timber, there's also like some form of like crabapple, and a few scrapes underneath that tree as well. So I'm going to key in on that location where those does come into the field, where I've gotten quite a bit of buck movement through there as well. Basically they're following those does out there. It's just that natural travel corridor to get into the food source. Again, same thing, you got a scrape right there, so if they do want to hit that scrape, they'll be within shooting range. So and then the other thing I've been focusing on, again, as it gets kind of said with this last talking about catching these deer going to food sources, that's the big one for this time of year, is if you have a good food source. So down at the farm, we've got the food plot, as well as, again, the old cut cornfield, and then the main, the big field, was plowed under. So there are some different grasses and whatnot in there. Again, not going to be the best, the highest draw, but if there is something green in there, especially with those warmer temperatures and the snow, not really being here, they'll be go out there eating anything that's green, or catching the last bit of the grain. So if you've got an old egg field, which we kind of got, or a food plot, that's really good. The other thing is I really like to key on is red oaks during this time of year. Again, if you're looking at red oak during the early season, they're not really going to be hitting those all that much. But this is the time of year where I see that pretty much every mature red oak that develop acorns, there's going to be the leaves turned up, deer in there digging. Even when I was up on the bluffs this last week, found a few, basically a patch of red oaks, and just the snow was absolutely tore up. You could see where the snow was tore up, the leaves were turned over, and there was deer tracks all over in there. So a nice food source like that, again, if you still have, any fruit trees, I still had any, apples left, just driving down the road, I saw out in some farmer's field, just some lone apple tree and just littered with apples that are still in tree and just absolutely covered on the ground. So some form of good food source it's definitely a thing you can key on for for this time of year. So to bring it back a little bit, so key in on the last bit of the primary or the secondary rut. If you start seeing scrapes open up, if you start seeing bucks cruising, you can key in on that rut activity. Again, it's not going to be nearly as active as the primary rut, but you may have one or two bucks that that are kind of out there in the seeking phase a little bit. They may even lock down on a doe, which you might be, again, same thing. If that doe's, as long as you don't spook that doe out, you may have an opportunity at that buck. So again, pretty much focusing on combination of the food source as well as that rut activity. Again, those does especially, they're going to be heading towards food. Focus on that food source, and then as bucks may come to those food sources to check those does or to eat. So you can kind of capitalize on both in that regard of focusing on where those does are at that good food source. If a buck's just hungry, he's going to come in and eat. If he's actually out cruising looking for does, especially in that area, he may seek out those food sources where he knows those does are going to be, to go check them out. So in regards to the times to hunt, for late season, I primarily focus on the evening hunts. Again, it's going to be very tough to get into hunt any type of food source in the mornings. So I rely a lot more on those evening hunts and just isolating on those food sources. Now, if I do go in for a morning hunt, kind of like I am this morning, it's going to be more in like a transition area or that travel corridor in between the food and bedding. So basically, again, what this spot is I'm going to is we've got a couple of clear cuts, and about 150 yards, 200 yards back from there is this little like pocket where it's just kind of like a bench. There's a little bit of like a marshy pond, depending on time of year. Sometimes it's full of water, sometimes it's more or less dry. And it's just that, kind of that area where there's a transition of some of the more pine cover into more mature hardwoods. So you just catch them on that edge as they travel back from food, heading back to bedding. But a lot of times too, you just gotta be careful, or at least I try to be very careful of my access route, because especially, being here in Michigan, those deer have been pressured quite a bit, basically over the past 2 months. And, especially after the rifle season with a lot of foot traffic, those deer are not going to tolerate much pressure or, perceived pressure from many hunters. So, really focusing on access routes, getting in and out, really focusing on your wind. By this time, a lot of even the does and younger deer are onto the smell of humans being in their area, and are not going to tolerate like they had earlier in the season, where if a doe or a younger deer walks downwind of you, they may spook, they may not. This time of year, it's almost a guarantee that they're not going to stick around. I had I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, but went out for a late season hunt, was going to set up on the food plot, and about 40 yards out from my blind was a trail camera. So I was like, well, I'll just walk the edge of the field, grab that card, and pull that card, see what was on it. Walked out, walked straight back, and while I was sitting, there was a year and a half old spike, or he might have been a 4-point, comes out, and the moment he hit my ground scent, as he was coming out to the food plot, he hit the brakes, stood there for about 10 seconds, and then turned right around and walked right back into the timber. One of those things that he clearly didn't like the ground scent, and just said, nope, I'm not going out in the food plot tonight, or at least not right now anyway. So that deer, earlier in the season, probably wouldn't have thought twice, but probably because of all the hunting pressure and and just being on edge and kind of educating himself on for the season. So this time of year, they know that pressure, they felt that pressure. You got to be very careful. At least I try to be very careful in regards to the access route and not spooking the deer, not allowing those deer to, again, especially ground scent. A lot of times, you can kind of get away with it this time of year. I try to make sure that I walk, at least where my ground scent is out past where I would get a shot. So, I'm not gonna, cut into, my stand area before, to where I wouldn't be able to get a shot before deer can hit my ground scent. So I will usually, especially in regards to, this hunt that I'm going to do with my dad, the spot I'm going to sit, I'm actually going to walk out and around, my stand to where the deer won't hit my ground scent until they're already out into the field a good ways. Basically just allowing that, they're not going to hit that ground scent before they step out into a shooting lane or in an area where I can shoot them. And then, covering your wind, I've seen it work in the past of using the Conquest set, Evercalm. That stuff does work in regards to, kind of calming down the deer a little bit. It's not going to completely cover your scent. Deer are probably still going to smell you. But the idea is that at least by that Evercalm being in the wind as well, it kind of chills out the deer a little bit. So basically, it smells like there's been deer in the area. I think I've told this story before, but it's I guess I'll give the two examples again, kind of a testimonial in regards to using some Evercalm to just help you out in the event that a deer does get downwind of you or that wind swirls a little bit. So one instance is that had pretty stiff wind during the late season, had laid out a fair amount of Evercalm on a couple of trees right next to the tree stand, and then a doe came through with a couple of fawns. I was going to give her the pass, let her keep going. Eventually, her and the fawns made it downwind. What she would do is she would blow. She would run, 20, 30 yards back to the direction she came from, look around, walk back, catch my scent again, blow, walk back, head back, or jump back, 20, 30 yards again. And she did this 3 or 4 times and just couldn't figure out, where she was catching my scent, which she knew was danger, but then was also catching the scent of the Evercalm. And it just seemed to confuse her a little bit because she'd be looking around trying to see where those other deer were, I assume. And eventually, this kind of went out a little bit wider than what she was trying to go through and eventually made it around me. But again, didn't completely blow out of there, didn't run off blowing like crazy. Another instance is that down at the farm, again, in December, I was hunting in some timber, and I basically kind of did like a 20-yard circle around me of Evercalm. So I marked like 4 or 5 different trees, just putting some of this Evercalm on it. Basically, I like to use their stick, dispenser, where it's basically like a deodorant stick, and you can just kind of rub it on a tree or whatnot. It's made with wax, so it kind of sticks and whatnot. And sitting there, and then a doe family group. So I think it had like 2, maybe 3 mature does, and then a couple of fawns. Well, they just kind of milling around, and while they're kind of milling around, I happened to look down at my watch to see what time it was, just so I can kind of get an idea of like, okay, this is the time the deer came through. The moment I put my head up, the old doe of the group, she pegged me in the tree, saw me moving. She was doing the head bob, staring me down. And same thing, she kind of, trotted off a little bit. She didn't blow, but she, ran about, 15, 20 yards. And kept an eye on me in the tree. The rest of the deer were kind of like looking at her like she was kind of crazy. Kind of milling around still because they were in that bubble of the cone of scent that I laid out. She eventually came back and wasn't real keen on what was in the tree, but seemed to have calmed down and actually came back and was kind of hanging out with the rest of the deer. One of the fawns actually bedded down 15 yards from the tree, and it was just hanging out there. And this is at like 9:30, 10 in the morning, I think it was. So it's one of those things that, even getting pegged in the tree, it just kind of calmed everything down, calmed the area down a little bit. That's a good thing to use especially if you got a swirling wind, or the wind's just not quite as consistent. Once you get out there, it's not going to completely prevent you from being busted, but it is going to buy you a little bit of time potentially to make a shot if a deer does get downwind, or like I said, if that wind's swirling around on you a little bit. So again, more important to worry about your access and the direction of the wind and hunt that, but that could help you out in those instances. And then, the big other thing is I try to key on in the late season is, utilize or focusing on those weather patterns. At this point, I usually like to hunt, just before a front, right after a front, and then also on those really clear, high pressure days that, basically are going to have, lack of cloud cover, to where it's going to suck a lot of the heat away. I usually key on that during my evening hunts over a nice food source or over the food plot. It just seems that, whenever we get those extremely cold temperatures, those teens or single digits, those deer, again, have to get up on their feet to feed. And, having that, like cloud cover just allows some of that heat to get pulled away a little bit sooner. And I've had good success of those deer coming out in those extreme cold temperatures onto those good food sources. And then usually right at the beginning of a cold front, or a snow, any type of low pressure front. So anytime when you catch just the beginning of a snow, I've seen a lot of movement in that regard, especially on trail cameras, especially, they'll spend a lot of those days from it's like, I'm not going to go out today. And sure enough, those cameras are blowing up as that snow starts to fall. Same thing, immediately following that snowfall, that full, 12 hours after that, a lot of times I see an increased movement as well after that snow as well. Again, same thing can happen. This time of year is kind of interesting where we're not getting rid of the snow, but we're still getting plenty of precipitation. Same thing applies to rain. So just before the rain starts, or if you can catch it in between, kind of like we had over the past 24 hours, where it's kind of like a hit or miss. Rain, the rain lets up, a little bit more rain. Last night when I hunted, we had, as I was going out, I had a decent rain. Before I was even done setting up in the tree, rain had stopped and the sun was shining. So those periods of where that rain starts to end, or you get like a light misty rain towards the end, I do see that a lot of times those deer will get up and start moving once that rain lets up. No different than when it's snowing. So those are kind of the things I'm really focusing on during this time of year. So again, it's food and weather. Really, that's the two things I'm really keen on. So so going forward, I've got this one last hunt with the muzzleloader, and then it's archery season for me. And then my oldest daughter, she's been chomping at the bit to get back out. So initially we had bought her just a single buck or a single tag, and not knowing how she would do with it and whatnot, thinking that we would get a tag later. And the one thing I didn't realize is that if you buy a single buck tag, that you can't turn around and buy a second one as kind of like that combo tag. So we're isolated just to get an antlerless tag, which we've got already. So basically starting tomorrow, she is open to be able to hunt does. We're gonna go out to the farm. Focus on that. That way we can use the 243 again. So, and she's eager to harvest another deer, which maybe at this point we kind of need her to. That way we can actually get some more venison in the freezer or can some more up. So we're going to be focused on that. I'm going to be going back to, grabbing the bow and going that route. And then worst case scenario, we'll go all out and harvest a few does with the rifle and let her, get the deer for the year, I guess. But so that's it. I'm gonna wrap this one up. Again, I gotta start getting my stuff ready to go out for another hunt. Hopefully everything goes according to plan today, and I don't get any more crazy scenarios or things to go wrong. So hopefully my luck changes here, today or even in the next few weeks. And then for anyone else that's out there still hunting, still looking to fill a tag or two, best of luck to you as well. And with that, as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.